Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Good Grief. My name is Dr. Christine Malone, and in this podcast, we talk about trauma, tragedy, and survival. In each episode, I will interview someone that has gone through grief in some way, and we will discuss the impact it has had on their life. By sharing these stories, we hope that others won't feel alone should they be going through similar situations. Enjoy. Okay, listeners, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. My guest today is going to tell us the story of her experience with her sister and some of the things that she went through in that grief process. So, guest, if you would introduce yourself and then just tell us a bit about your sister.
My name is Deborah Kasdan, and my book about my sister is Roll Back the World, A Sister's Memoir. My sister, Rachel, was 3.5 years older than me. She passed away some years ago, 2003, and that's when I began thinking about writing this book. Rachel, I guess the story starts when she came home after a gap year in a high school gap year in Israel, working on a kibbutz. And she had been a little bit troubled before, very creative woman, very teenager, very bright, artistic, played the piano, the oboe, she drew, and above all, she wrote poetry. She didn't, and she was very well-read. She loved Walt Whitman, philosophy, poetry, but she also loved the outdoors. She loved working on the kibbutz. She did not want to go to college right away, she said. So she found a group going to Israel and worked on a kibbutz. And she just loved it. It was active. She loved physical labor. She she planted crops, she harvested them, she did childcare, she just did everything in the kibbutz. And when she came home, it was so exciting to see her. She looked so different. She was bronzed and her eyes were just vivid blue, and she was muscular from all the work. And she was charismatic. She was very cosmopolitan, and all my friends gathered around her and her friends, and she, exotic looking, and she just seemed so healthy and happy, but she didn't want to be going to college now. She wanted to travel. And she said she wanted to get out of St. Louis, where we were living. She went to New York City to live with friends that she had met in Israel. And she was on the Lower East Side. And then she kind of bounced around. She went to San Francisco. That's where everything was happening in San Francisco. This was the mid-60s. She graduated high school in 61, a year in Israel. Yeah, so about 63, and a lot happening there. And one day she came back from Israel and told me that she had been followed by two men all the way from New York to to San Francisco. And I could see the fear in her eyes. And I knew something was wrong. Now, there had been issues that my parents were dealing with, and they kept saying, Rachel needs help. And I was always saying, oh, come on, let her live her life. I admired her, but I began to see that there was something to this concern. Her employer had called my parents when she was in San Francisco and told her to get her back home. There was something wrong, and they did. I was in college then. After my first year of college, I was away for the summer working at a summer camp. And that's when I found out that she had been institutionalized. Apparently, she was going off now with a friend in Montreal, and the friend called up my parents and said, something's happening with Rachel. She's not acting right. and they took her off, and there were emergency room visits. And finally, that summer of 1965, she was committed to the state hospital. And this was just traumatic for the family. I found it hard to even remember learning about it. That's how traumatic it was. It was just, I just blocked it out. In the process of doing the book, I recovered some of this, but it was just traumatic because there were 3 other siblings. There's myself, my younger brother, 2 years younger than me, and my younger sister, 7 years younger than me. And we weren't together when this happened. My younger sister was a camper at the camp I was working at, and my brother was off in a summer program in Seattle. So we didn't understand what was happening. We didn't understand why she was being committed, or why her freedom was being taken away. And that was the beginning of the deinstitutionalization years, when people were being taken out of the hospitals.
So
And so after,
was she diagnosed when she was entered into the hospital or admitted to the hospital? That's when she was diagnosed.
yeah, it was they diagnosed her with schizophrenia. It's a collection of symptoms. The primary symptom is hearing voices. I'm not sure how much of that applied to her. She certainly didn't talk about the voices she heard. Later on, I did hear her mumbling sometimes. So, there seemed to be something going on. She would not admit to them. She was very proud and very suspicious. So she kept things to herself, but her thought was definitely disorganized, and she was not thinking rationally. She was very impulsive in her behavior, taking off and going places. So all that wonderful creativity and dedication to writing and working was just all gone. Her life was just a big jumble. When she went into the hospital, that was the beginning of, I guess, the first generation of medications, psychotropic medications that were given in very heavy doses. So when I saw her at the end of that summer, she was just terribly sedated and angry. So it was very hard. My parents wanted to protect the other siblings, so we didn't get involved that much. I went on to my second year of college. My brother started the first year, and we were encouraged to lead our own lives. And I did, but I felt I didn't know what questions to ask. I didn't know what to say. I wrote to Rachel. I visited her when I was home, but it was hard to connect. She wasn't the same person anymore. So then there were attempts to get her out of the hospital. The hospital was putting people into the community, because the idea was, and is still now, not to isolate people with mental illness, but to integrate them into the community. However, the resources there were rather poor, and she was dismissed. She was discharged into very rough areas of the city of St. Louis, where boarding houses. I don't think the people there had any training in dealing with this, people with the illness, and she endured some tough times. She was assaulted, she was raped, she was always calling, come get me. She would end up on the street, so she would be readmitted. So there was that whole revolving door syndrome that everybody knows about. Even these days, it's still happening. So it was really hard on the siblings, and my parents were pretty distraught. They did not feel she was doing that well in the hospital. And to me, she looked terrible. She just Well, there were times though. It was not all, it was not there. I mean, there were ups and downs. I ended up getting married quite young, partly as a result of this. And she came to my wedding, but when I look at the pictures, her face is one of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia is affect, inability to feel pleasure, a lack of affect. In other words, there's no expression on her face. And so there's just like almost she's wearing a mask. Part of it was the medication, part of it was the illness. I'm not sure where one ended and the other began. So that was the first years of the story.
Great. So she was eventually released from the hospital and out on her own, or was she never really got to the point where she could be on her own?
She was in and out. My parents did not approve of this community program that the hospital was running, and they actually filed a federal suit saying she had a right to treatment that got settled. There was a settlement, a consent decree, and the state had to make some changes. At that point, my brother decided the consent decree meant that she would be committed to the hospital forever. She would never get out. He thought that was my parents' intent. And I told him, no, no, they just want to improve conditions and then ultimately she can get out. But he was very wary of this whole thing and offered to take her to live with him in Seattle.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
and that's a whole other section of the
yeah,
story.
how old was she at that time? So she's been in the hospital how many years by that time?
She was in the hospital 15 years by that time. Oh, he was also very upset that she was diabetic and they were giving her insulin. He wanted to have a more natural treatment. He was looking at alternative treatments. He thought it was because the food was so bad. So 15 years. So that was like 19. So 15 years, she was 20. She was in her late 30s.
Okay. Okay. So what, I mean, I know eventually she passes away. So how old was she when that happened?
She lived till 59,
Okay.
which is about on target for serious people with serious mental illness. I think the usual figure is that lops 20 years off your life, largely because your medical needs are not well attended to. And she ended up, I had seen her shortly before she died, and she had a horrible, horrible cough. It was smoker's cough. She smoked incessantly. It was bronchitis, and overnight it turned into a pneumonia that
Yeah.
and that's what, and so but there was 15 years in St. Louis, and then there were 15 years in the Pacific Northwest, and that's a whole different part of the
Right.
story.
Right.
um
So after she passed, you said here that you wanted to investigate what happened and why. So was there some kind of a suspicion that some of like foul play or something, or what
oh
was?
no, 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 no. In fact, they did the coroner talked to me, a medical examiner talked to me, um and they said there was no a man she was with reported it, and
Oh, okay.
he had his own issues, and but they said he was there was no suspicion of him. It was the medical, they found it. So but when she died, that's when I felt I had to write her story. It just hit me like a ton of bricks. uh, I was going to have to channel this story. She had been sidelined so long on the fringes of society, and she had so much potential, and even when she was sick she continued to write. And I wanted people to know her name and know about her life. So that was a mission that I kind of took on, that I had to tell this story. But in addition to the mission, I felt I had to solve, because I didn't really understand why this has gotten so bad with her. I mean, other people are treated and they have some level of recovery or stabilization. Why did Rachel's illness become so bad and chronic? And so I did a lot of excavation to to get at that. And, I came up with some theory, I can't know for sure, but I came up with some ideas that made sense to me. I wrote about her earliest years. I felt that we know that schizophrenia has a genetic component,
Right.
but why did she get it and not me? Um, well, she was 3.5 years older. She was born during World War II in a very stressful situation. She was living, my mother and she was born in Cleveland. My mother, who had been abandoned herself as a child, married my father, who was, let me go back a minute. My mother was abandoned as a child and grew up in an orphanage because her mother had to work as a domestic, and that's how she was able to take care of them. Her mother visited her, but she didn't have her father. So she met my father when he was a graduate student in Chicago. They got married. His family did not approve of my mother because she came from a poor immigrant, and so, but when he got drafted and she was pregnant, they went to live in Cleveland with the in-laws. They didn't get along. It was very stressful for my mother. They loved Rachel, but then as soon as my father came back, they moved out, and Rachel, who knew her grandfather as her father and was surrounded by cousins, all of a sudden was with this new man in her life, her father. And I think there was a lot of dynamics and antagonism. My father had to start a new life. He had to start his career. He had his instant family. Rachel hadn't known him for 2 years. So I think the stress, all of that stress in her earliest years, was part of what they call an epigenetic factor, which is where the environment influences the expression of genetic code. So, it can be dormant, but stress will pull it out. And so my thought process was that she was vulnerable because of those 3.5 years before I was born. So I write about that. I mean, I have to imagine what it was like. I mean, I know from very long interviews with my mother what it was like for her, but I had to kind of reconstruct those whole scenes.
So is your book written
So
from her perspective, or is it written from your perspective as you
it's
remember her?
written it's written from my perspective. One of the challenges of writing it was to give her a voice. And to clarify who it's about. Like, people would say, are you writing about you, or are you writing about your sister? Fact is, I'm writing about her, I'm writing about me, and I'm writing about her family. So I kind of thought of it as a braided story with these three strands.
Right.
I guess in the foreground is her story, but I'm definitely telling it. And I'm also writing about how I dealt with it, and how my family dealt with it, and
Right.
how that all came together.
So when you published the book, well, who was your intended audience? Who did you think would be most interested in reading your
Yeah.
book?
Well, first of all, I think any family member who goes through something like this, uh, mainly I'm thinking about mental illness, but also people who have gone through other serious challenges with a sibling, um, and who have felt unable to help somebody they loved. So I think anybody can relate that. I was thinking people in the mental health field who want to know what it was like, kind of historic look, and see what's still relevant today, to have the kind of a detailed family history around one person. Might be interested in that. Students of social work or psychology, but it's also my story of people who want to read about overcoming this grief, of overcoming these types of challenges, of how to manage a life when you have, I think they call it now, I just read ambiguous grief.
Mm,
You're grieving over a person that you kind of lost, but you didn't really lose,
yeah,
and how you balance that.
right.
So,
Yeah, grieving what she was like before, which you remember well, to what she was like,
mhm,
after she was on medications and so on and so forth.
yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that as you were writing the book, you kind of had to think back or remember back and bring up some memories that maybe weren't so fresh for you. So what was that process like? And I mentioned that I have written my own autobiography, and I know for me to go back and think up things and remember things wasn't easy at times. So how did that really work for you? Did you find it healing? Did you find it helpful? I mean, how was that for you?
Well, I needed help to deal with the pain. So I myself was in therapy, and that allowed the grief to come out. I'm at home. Um, I just retired, and I've got wonderful grandchildren. I wanted to enjoy life. My husband and I both retired, um, but I wanted to tell the story. So I needed help managing the grief, having somebody who would listen. I could deal with it there, and then, go home and resume my life. So that was one part of it. Um, then the very act of writing itself, it's just funny the way it works. You just start with what you remember, and then as you write, more comes back. I'm sure you experience that too.
Yeah,
It almost pulls it out of you.
yeah,
And I was in writing workshops, and that helped too. People would ask questions, and that's a good question. And it kind of percolate, and I'd come up with an answer.
yeah,
So,
yeah. No, that's great. Now I know you also have a website. So what is the structure of your website? What is it?
oh, okay. Well, some people who read it early on said, what did Rachel look like? I mean, I have some basic description of her. And for one reason or another, I didn't get any pictures in the book, just production technicalities. So I put pictures on the website. I have a little carousel of pictures on the website. And just why I wrote the book. I have some quotes from reviews, and then, where you can buy it, um, links to where you can buy it. Um, I may do more with it later on, but right now that's basically what it is. But I think people might enjoy the photos
Yeah,
particularly.
yeah, no, I understand. I'll definitely want to look them up for sure after hearing your story. So, yeah, let's put a face to the story. So, if you were, if we had a listener who was listening who either is, family member has been given this diagnosis, schizophrenia is just such a terrible disease, and knowing what you know now, what it was going to be like, what would your recommendation be? What would you say? I mean, you mentioned maybe that kind of your family didn't talk about it much or so on. I mean, would you wish there'd been a change in that, or how different? It was a different
Mhm.
time. I know that it was a different time for one thing, so things obviously are different now, with treatments and so on. But what would you offer there?
Well, if you're a sibling and you're not the one in control, I'd say try to stay connected, in a nice way. Just kind of insert yourself in the treatment discussions. If you're an adult sibling, at least. Today we have the internet, so it's easy to find information. We didn't have that then. Um, so learn as much as you can. Uh, there are advocacy organizations like NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, with chapters in every area, major city, and outlying other areas as well. And I would connect with them because they have lots of information, and they have courses and seminars where you can that are specifically designed to help families understand and balance self-care with care for your loved one, because that's such a tightrope to walk.
Yeah,
I would also consider alternative approaches. Schizophrenia has always been a terrible disease, but there are alternative treatments which I'm more hopeful of than I was back then, when it happened. There are hearing voices networks where people who have gone through they call it psychosis, or alternate extreme states, will sit and listen and help a person suffering now to get through it. Medication may or may not be involved, but it's not the centerpiece. So I've been learning about that, and I think there's a lot of promise there. If you think medication is not the only answer. So
Right.
that's Hearing Voices Network, NAMI. I think those are two good sources of help. And you're going to need help dealing with that whole issue of what do I do? How much am I responsible for? And I think it's good to get some counseling for that yourself. I mean, I rejected the idea when I was young, but I rejected it at a cost. I kept the whole issue, down inside of me. And I suffered from depression myself, even though I had such support from my husband. This was inside of me. And later, when I sought help, and then later when I wanted to write the book, that I realized that I needed to talk to somebody about it, what I was responsible for, what I could have done, the choices I made, just thinking that all through. It
Yeah.
would have been better had I done it earlier, is what I'm saying.
So I just wrote myself a note, self-care. So kind of self-care being, you need to
Yeah.
definitely make that a priority so that you are, taking care of yourself first. And I completely understand that the thought about, when you kind of feel helpless, can't really help this person because, you can't fix it. So there's that. Um, so you also mentioned to me kind of like that. I use the term survivor's guilt, which is kind of weird, but that the term, how you feel a little bit guilty that like you said, why not me? Why did it happen to my sister, and why not me, and so on and so forth. So, part of that probably was you were helped with that some of that self care and the counseling and stuff to help you get over some of that.
Yeah, counseling therapy helps with that. But just facing it. I mean, I rejected the idea at first, but I came to accept it, and in a way that uh, I couldn't keep distance. I just had to own it. And when I owned it, then I was relieved of it. It's kind of paradoxically, but yeah.
No, I understand that.
Um,
So health, mental illness is a stigmatized thing in our society. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, don't want to recognize it. Some people don't even recognize it as being a genuine, illness or so on, because
mm,
you don't see the broken arm, you don't see this. It's it may be more invisible. So do you find over the years, if you've talked about your sister, where you've ever kind of experienced someone who, oh, we don't want to talk about that, or it just makes them uncomfortable to talk about it and so on?
oh, yeah. I remember one uh, lunch I was at with a bunch of women, and somebody said, "Oh, let's everybody say something about yourself that nobody knows." So I said, "Well, I have a sister who's in a psychiatric hospital, mentally ill, schizophrenia." And then somebody said, "Oh, let's talk about happy things."
Yeah, right.
And I was like, "Oh, why did I say that?"
Yeah, no, well, it was your norm. I mean, that's why you said.
Yeah.
I think I've really hope that our society will become more comfortable talking about mental health issues, because I mean, so many people don't have treatment because they don't want to admit it. It's culturally, it can be a bit of a stigma, but definitely, yeah, was thinking they probably would have a story about that, because I know I have had several myself from different family issues. So yeah,
Especially schizophrenia. For
yeah.
some reason, like bipolar is not as stigmatizing as schizophrenia. Go figure. I don't know
You
why,
know,
but
I
you
would say,
know.
if you think about it, what our media does to our mindset, right? So when you look at shows
Mhm.
where some of the character has schizophrenia, like, I remember an episode of ER many years ago where a patient came in, had schizophrenia, and he ended up killing someone and stabbing someone. It was one of those where they just make it sound like you're just so incapable of interacting with people. That's kind of the picture that's put out there. Whereas
Yeah.
that's just kind of, I've done a lot of research into what
our media and what movies and shows are training us about certain topics, especially when it comes
Right.
to mental illness. And that's definitely one of the ones where some of them just seem scarier than others or whatever, or
Yeah.
incurable or not treatable or whatever. And that definitely falls into that. Schizophrenia definitely falls into that category of, I think, more of the more unknown white.
But it is treatable.
Yes. Yeah.
And some people function very well.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. Yep. I have a good friend and who
yeah.
does function well with medications, and he's doing really well.
Mhm.
So yeah, but then again, other people don't respond as well. So,
Mhm.
well, before we end, is there anything else you'd like to share for our listeners?
Yeah. I didn't go into the last half of the story. This is just too long about what happened to her in the Pacific Northwest. But a wonderful caseworker, social worker, was able to get her into a outpatient treatment program, a community-based, not hospital-based, but a community-based outpatient treatment program. And they were able to get her supportive housing so that she was able to have a little cabin in the woods. Not a, well, I mean, there were other houses, they're very small houses, like little houses like they have today. A cluster of them in the woods near the river, which was just perfect for Rachel because she loved nature. She could go for walks whenever she wanted. She had her freedom. And then the agency brings her medicine to her. They come and do health checks when she needed help shopping. They would take care of that, take her to medical appointments, that type of thing. So she was supervised, but she had her freedom.
Right. Yeah.
And I think, yeah, I think if these programs can do a lot for people if they're funded. If they're not funded, they don't have the staff, they don't have the means to do it well. So I just hope that everybody will understand that people with who have this type of psychosis and chronic illness can live in the community. Even though we have mental health crisis, homelessness crisis, there's no need to push them back into hospitals. They may need very short stays if they have a bad episode, but they can be in the community. And when a community is welcoming to them, and this community was, there were some great stories that are in the book about how she was accepted, that it makes all the difference. And I just hope people will support having people live freely in their own environments, in their own communities, and support that type of treatment.
I think that goes to what we were just talking about with the stigma too. I think if enough of that happens, and we see that as our norm now in the community, right? It's more like, oh, of course, well, that's so and so over here, and whatever. It's not abnormal. Whereas if it is seen as abnormal, that's where that's scary because we don't talk about it, and so on.
Right. I mean, and you can sometimes identify people who are on medication, but there's no reason to be afraid of them.
Right.
And sometimes they seem to be on their own. Maybe their families were not able to help them, take care of them, or to include them in their lives, but communities can take the place of families, or they can augment families.
Yep.
And I think it's just a good way to look at that inclusive view.
Yeah, well, it's good for both the person who, the patient, the person with this illness, and with the community as a whole. It's kind of like integrating kids with special needs into, generic regular classrooms, right? It's good
Right,
for
right,
everybody.
right.
So that makes perfect sense. Well, I will get your the link to your website and to your book, which we'll post when your episode airs, so that listeners can find that, see Rachel's pictures on your website and how that goes along with your book and so on. But I want to thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed hearing about your sister. Yeah, and I hope you're doing well.
I am. Thank you, Christine. This was a great interview. I enjoyed it too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Good Grief. To hear more about my personal story, please pick up a copy of my book, The Day I Became the Spider Killer, a memoir of trauma, tragedy, and survival, available in paperback, Kindle, and Audible via Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online book retailers.